The morning the church filled with quiet expectation, the hush tasted like wax and pressed linen. Guests leaned forward, breath folded into the stained glass light. And then the impossible happened. The bride raised the ceremonial cup, offered it in gentle ritual, and within the span of a single held breath she convulsed. White foam at the corner of her mouth, the lace of her dress collapsing like a pale tide. Her voice broke into a desperate whisper that threaded through the pews. "The wine, it burns." Everyone turned, horrified, toward the woman at the head of the pew who watched without flinching. For those 10 seconds the world contracted to a single, obscene image, a life undone at the threshold of promise. Listen closely, the truth you are about to hear will insist upon you. If you feel the pull, if the cold of this secret touches you, type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And before this tale moves further, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Your town, your state, so that this wound of history becomes a map we trace together. Hartford, October 13th, 1841. Steamboats breathed along the Connecticut. Factories stitched smoke into the skyline, and the old order found itself bargaining with progress. Elalina Peaton, 48, widow of a shipping heir, ran her household like a tight ledger. Her son William returned from Yale with a mind that wandered into the world of books and a heart that landed, disobedient, on an Irish seamstress named Bridget O'Sullivan. Bridget's intelligence shone quietly. In crowded lecture halls she seemed a light that some genteel eyes could not imagine in their circles. The idea of this match to Elalina was not a romance but a threat, a dilution of name, a fracturing of authority. She had not been born into fortune. She had married into it and learned to protect it as others protect heirlooms. That morning's collapse would become a prism, refracting a city's prejudices, private calculations, and the slow mechanics of respectability. Among the satin and candlelight, someone watched with a composure that was not fear but calculation, a presence that would resist explanation and demand investigation for years to come. Still, the story does not begin with the collapse at Trinity. It tumbles backward into rooms where habit had hardened into authority. Elalina Peaton wore influence the way some women wore jewels. As proof the world had been arranged in her favor, widowhood had taught her a quiet arithmetic, how to count alliances, how to bend public opinion with a glance, a compliment, a donation. She kept ledgers like prayer books and read newspapers as if reading omens. To her, the Peaton name was a fragile heirloom. It required shoring. She remembered being small, a merchant's daughter who learned thrift and the etiquette of assent. Marriage to Jonathan turned those lessons into proximity to real power. Money arrived, invitations multiplied, and the family mansion on Prospect Street became a stage for a performance she would not relinquish. Her son William grew with that stage in his bones. Tall, curious, inclined toward books and argument rather than the boardroom certainties his mother prized. He carried his father's name with a kind of casual courage that unsettled Elalina. Bridget O'Sullivan entered their world quietly, a seamstress with a mind that liked to roam. She asked questions at public lectures and read borrowed verse by candlelight. Her origin, County Dublin, was spoken of in Hartford as if it were a rumor rather than a person. When William began to court her, his manner was simple, steady, and earnest. The couple walked by the river, read together, and imagined a life that disregarded pedigree. For William the gesture was romantic. For his mother it was a fracture. Elalina's reaction was not dramatic at first. She did not storm, she observed. Her tactics were patient and precise. She listened for slips at social gatherings, cultivated allies among matrons whose memory of her former position still glowed, and conditioned conversation to isolate the young woman. She moved through Hartford like a patient tide, collecting details where Bridget worshipped, who employed her, which street she walked. Each fact became a lever. She believed that with enough pressure, the match would unravel on its own, and she would remain, as always, the keeper of consequence. The confrontation arrived not in fury but in the ordinary cadence of family life. William, at 23, brought Bridget to small lectures and quiet walks. He spoke of proposals quietly, with a confidence born of private certainties. Elalina pretended indifference until one humid afternoon, when she decided, with the kind of curiosity that becomes weaponized, to surprise him at his office. She carried a pitcher of cold lemonade, a gesture that was both maternal and ceremonial, and climbed the narrow stairwell intent only on pleasantry. She halted on the landing when voices came through the door, William's baritone and a woman's thoughtful reply. "My mother will never accept this," someone said. The words were ordinary, but they struck like a bell. Elalina pressed her back to the wall and felt a heat she would later call indignation, but that in those first seconds felt like the dull beginning of a fever. She withdrew, the picture clutched as if it were evidence or a promise, and returned home with the carriage's horses hardly feeling her hand on the reins. That night, she listened to William as if listening to a contract, not a son. He announced his love as if reading a decision, his eyes bright with the earnestness that made him reckless. Elalina's composure cracked into the careful calculation of a strategist. She did not refuse him outright. Instead, she began an investigation that would be mistaken by many as mere social maneuvering. She studied Patrick O'Sullivan's employment, the family's church, the seamstress's references. She learned which matrons softened at Bridget's name and which tightened their lips. She attended ladies' aid meetings and parlor calls not as a parent, but as an intelligence officer, asking questions that sounded like concern and recording answers like testimony. Inexorably, she mapped the city's inclination and prepared. In early October, sleepless in the parlor with gaslight low, Elalina turned through old papers like a general reading after battle dispatches. The house muttered around her. Clocks, the distant foot of a servant, but her attention narrowed to a shoebox of correspondence. Among legal briefs and invoices were a few letters from Jonathan's New York associate, dry business notes that mentioned obscure industrial compounds and textile experiments. Those words, inert on the page, felt to her like the outline of an instrument. She folded the letters and read them until the ink blurred. Possibility felt like permission when combined with desperation. To Elalina, parchment and phrase were instruments. A name in ink suggested an opening she could exploit without the vulgarity of threat. She began to think in terms of vantage and ritual, mapping how people moved, where hands lingered, which cousins preferred the east pew, and which guests were given the privilege of pouring wine. Observing the small choreography of a ceremony, she glimpsed leverage. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say it aloud, and let the phrase anchor the sense that you, too, are being inducted into an uncomfortable knowledge. She spent days rehearsing how sorrow should appear: the fallen fan, the sudden faintness, the carefully placed condolence. Yet underneath the performance was a cleaner motive: preservation of a legacy she imagined as fragile and morally legitimate. She convinced herself that erasing a threat to the family's name was mercy. She prepared pity and scorn like costumes, practiced the look of shocked sorrow, and positioned herself where observation would validate her grief. In the hours before the wedding, she wore control like armor, and in that armor she felt dangerous and untouchable. When the day arrived, her bearings were precise and her heart, perversely, felt clean. Outside, Hartford breathed and could not imagine yet. October arrived with a brittle ease. Invitations folded into envelopes, the pews were assigned, and the city generated the kind of curiosity specific to social transitions: who would attend, which tables would shift, who would manage the delicate arithmetic of acceptance and ostracism. The Peaton home hummed with a different tune. Elalina moved like a conductor, arranging who sat where at rehearsal dinners, choosing which cousins would head larger conversations, and ensuring that every line of the service followed a careful choreography. Bridget prepared for her vows with an almost innocent dignity. She sewed a simple hem on her wedding gown the night before, humming soft snatches of old Irish songs, unaware of how her very ordinariness had become an offense in some eyes. William, meanwhile, behaved like a man who believed that love could rearrange the harsh architecture of society. He held her hands in public as if that small insistence were a shield. Friends called the match brave or reckless depending on their mood, but the couple moved forward. The week preceding the ceremony saw Hartford split into softened sympathy and thinly veiled scorn. At small salons, women whispered about propriety, men debated alliances in clubs, and the local press passed the announcement with polite curiosity that nevertheless hid alarm. Elalina herself presented a face of brittle acceptance. She gave compliments with knives in sheaths and practiced condolences that would read as genuine to distant listeners. On the morning of the wedding, the air in the drawing room felt too clean, washed of excess emotion to reveal only consequence. Patrick O'Sullivan, proud and anxious, kept a formal distance, but his eyes betrayed the hope that had carried his family westward. Bridget's sisters adjusted veils, trembling with excitement and nerves. Through the streets, parishioners paused to watch the carriage pass, sensing that this ceremony had become a litmus test for Hartford itself. Each glance felt like a ledger entry to or impressions recorded, reputations balanced, the future quantified. Trinity's nave received them with the hush of sanctified weather, candles trembling as if the light itself were holding its breath. For a few sharp moments the city outside did not exist, and the narrative of two young people joining life felt absolute and unassailable. Bridget stood with a modest courage that softened even skeptical faces. William pronounced his vows with a steadiness that drew private tears from some who had not expected such earnestness. The officiant pronounced the old words, and the congregation moved with practiced ritual. Nina sat where sight and distance met, an ordered figure among softer fabrics. She accepted a cousin's touch and kept her face composed. She followed the ceremony like an accountant reading accounts, translating gentle gestures into data and mapping where attention would fall. Ordinary kindnesses, a handkerchief, a steadying arm, would later be remembered as proof of a genial day. Several of those gestures had been subtly orchestrated to shift gaze away from particular movements and to create plausible lines of sight. Beneath the organ's melody thrummed an invisible economy of class and lineage, a low question about whether established families could absorb an Irish daughter. In one suspended beat, Bridget raised the cup, smiled at William, and drank with the trusting calm of someone who believed ritual itself protected them. Then, without warning, her body folded inward, the hush ruptured and chaos flooded the nave. People surged forward, some lifting her, others pressing cloth to her face as the officiant's litany dissolved into frantic calls for aid. William cradled her and begged for help with a sound that split the room and made the congregation feel suddenly hollow. A neighbor echoed the single line she had managed to gasp, a phrase that would be repeated like a judgment: "The wine, it burns." Local physicians arrived from nearby houses, their faces tight with bewilderment. They felt for pulse and called for haste. The congregation pressed outward as whispers hardened into accusations, and Hartford's polite air curdled into rumor and fear immediately. In the hours after the collapse, Trinity emptied into a city suddenly bright with rumor. Carriages sped away, and clusters of people spilled onto cobbled streets, disputing what they had seen. Word moved faster than facts. Neighbors supplied half-remembered gestures, and servants offered details they considered remarkable. William Undone began a private search for answers. He combed the house for records, questioned servants bluntly, and demanded clearer explanations from physicians. Patrick O'Sullivan paced like a man who had placed all his hope on an ocean-going bargain and watched the sea swallow his gains. His grief was sharp but practical as he sought to protect his children from scandal. Nina moved through the confusion like an immovable landmark, her grief performed with precision. She answered questions in measured tones and offered condolences that seemed sincere. A small committee gathered local physicians, a magistrate, and a handful of leading citizens whose names carried weight. They conferred in whispers and arranged for a preliminary examination, an inquest that would be as much about reputation as fact. Reports circulated quickly about symptoms and the strange suddenness of Bridget's fall, but the language of diagnosis in Hartford was porous and shaped by prejudice. Some suggested fainting or an undiagnosed malady, others, more brittle, implied darker causes. Rumor sought culprits in predictable places, among those already regarded as foreign, or among families with grudges, and always, disturbingly, toward the idea of a mother's secret malice, because narratives of familial control were easy to imagine and harder to disprove. Those fragments would later harden into scaffolding for accusation, but in the immediate aftermath they were dismissed as the unstable recollections of those without rank. William privately asked his mother for answers. She replied calmly and briefly, offering words that both soothed and set his doubts alight. The inquest convened in a chamber smelling of beeswax and wool, A small group of magistrates, physicians, and civic men assembled to convert chaos into record. Witnesses described who arrived, who served, and which hands moved. Testimony began to shape a fragile sequence of events as memory and observation braided together. Physicians spoke with professional caution: sudden collapse, rapid failure of breath, but 19th-century diagnosis offered ambiguity and invited conjecture. Fragments emerged: a maid who recalled a cup set aside, a guest who remembered a hand near the table, and then withdrawing, small details that carried disproportionate weight under scrutiny. Local newspapers circled the story with cautious appetite, balancing readers' hunger for scandal against the power of prominent family names that bought ink and silence. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say the phrase and let it act as an invocation for what we now recount. The magistrates sought a resolution that would preserve civic calm. There was quiet pressure to find an explanation that did not shatter established decorum. Some medical men favored natural causes, others suggested the possibility of foul play without articulating means, leaving the inquest suspended between suspicion and uncertainty. Ila testified with practiced sorrow, her bearing lending credibility that bent the shape of questions and shaded the reception of certain testimonies. A servant's note about a cup returned would be later highlighted, its meaning adjusted by repetition and retelling, and thus rumor found a place in formal record. As days passed, public desire for clarity grew, but the interplay of justice and social capital ensured the loudest names could shape how much daylight found the facts. The inquest closed without indictment. Hartford returned to its routines with divided accounts, some convinced of malice, others insisting on tragic accident, and the disagreement would haunt conversations for years. The inquest's ambiguous closure did not end the story. It sharpened fault lines and made private reasoning public. For now, the wound was bandaged by decorum and the politics of reputation still. The inquest's ambiguous closure did not end the story. It sharpened fault lines and made private reasoning public. Where courts would not speak, salons and kitchens did, and gossip took on the authority of evidence for anyone willing to repeat it 2 or 3 times. William Undone began a private search for answers. He combed the house for records, questioned servants bluntly, and demanded clearer explanations from physicians. Patrick O'Sullivan, already bruised by the city's whispers, focused on consolation and the care of his remaining children, refusing to be baited into public quarrels he feared would leave scars beyond repair. Ilalina moved with an unshakable composure, but her control concealed a calculus. She received condolence visitors with a softness that disarmed critics, and in private she worked to shore up alliances, visiting influential households and reminding acquaintances of debts and mutual favors. Servants began whispering. A maid mentioned a glass set aside and returned. A footman recalled the order dishes were cleared. When sewn together, these memories sketched a pattern. Yet the city itself found reasons to look away. Hartford's elite treasured stability more than absolutes, and institutions bent to the wishes of those with influence. Legal maneuvering began to appear, wills revisited, property arrangements reconsidered, and thin notes exchanged between lawyers advising restraint. William confronted his mother. She denied wrongdoing with a voice of wounded dignity, and her denial left him suspended between love and suspicion. He pursued every loose lead, whispered accounts, discarded receipts, and the quiet testimony of a laundress who recalled a faint dust on a napkin. Some witnesses recanted when called before men of position, others were persuaded to silence through acts of patronage. The affair taught many a civic lesson: influence could reroute inquiry, and the truth often folded itself into the creases of convenience, making it difficult to retrieve intact. As months passed, the affair calcified into opposing narratives, half-truths hardening into town lore. William dug through the Peaton archives where ledgers and letters lay like bones. Among them were notes from his father's correspondence that mentioned industrial compounds in abstract terms. That scrap of ink became a hinge for him, suggesting knowledge and therefore, in his mind, possible intent, yet the papers offered no confession or neat answer. In Parler's theories mixed prejudice with speculation. The O'Sullivans felt it in customers lost and the quiet stares of employers. Elanina maintained public acts of charity and visible sorrow that some took as evidence of genuine grief and others read as performance. A footman confided that he had once seen Elanina reading correspondence similar to the papers William had found. The detail was tentative, but when retold it gathered shape. Rumor transformed tentative observation into apparent design. People prefer narrative to nuance, and Hartford demanded a tidy story. Without charges, social punishments multiplied, invitations rescinded, business ties frayed, and alliances recalibrated according to perceived loyalties. William grew gaunter and withdrew. He sought a scholar's eye for the documents, hoping to pry clarity from ink and ledger without the filter of social consequence. He wrote letters to distant relatives and to men who had been his father's associates, requesting access to archives in New York and Boston. Some replies were courteous and evasive, others were blunt refusals. He learned that the financial maneuvers which had secured the Peaton fortune were woven into obligations and alliances that made legal action perilous. Lawyers counseled restraint, bankers advised discretion, and clergy urged reconciliation rather than public fragmentation. William pressed on nevertheless, hiring an antiquarian who promised to read marginalia and compare handwriting, and a physician who would revisit the notes and the account of symptoms. These investigations produced new fragments, marginal annotations, a ledger entry crossed out, a name circled in haste. Each fragment deepened suspicion, but no single piece offered incontrovertible proof. Time passed, and with each season the sharpness of public interest dulled, but private attention sharpened in darker corners. Friends of Bridget's family kept quiet, fearing that any vocal support would cost them livelihoods. Others whispered that power could silence a truth no less easily than it could sound it. Seasons passed, and the Trinity story folded into other civic tales, losing some edges and sharpening others. William's inquiries produced fragments, marginal notes, a ledger scrawl, a smudge on a receipt. None proved guilt, but each irritated and demanded explanation. Insiders murmured of favors and discreet exchanges that bent testimony. A donated church bench here, a quietly offered patronage there, suggesting an architecture of influence. Elanina increased her public acts, charity drives, pews secured for the poor, receptions that presented her sorrow as genuine and proper, the O'Sullivans standing when through absence of invitation, and the slow erosion of social capital rather than through any legal finding. Behind the Peaton doors, William pleaded for records and answers. Elanina answered with measured maternal protest, and in their friction the family's cohesion frayed. Employees left or married away, acquaintances shifted alliances, the drawing room emptied into smaller, quieter circles. Lawyers drafted settlements and adjusted wills to protect assets. Civic leaders preferred discretion to scandal, and institutions learned how to archive ambiguity. Yet in kitchens and back rooms, Bridget's friends collected memories, trading small tokens of mourning and keeping alive a private library of grievance. Public life returned to routine, but privately the memory of that day at Trinity remained an ember, ready, with a careless phrase or a newly found paper, to be fanned into flame. In the years that followed, the incident at Trinity became a quiet dossier people referenced when warning younger kin about the costs of defying social expectation. Mothers used it to caution daughters, merchants used it when negotiating marriages, ministers used it to remind congregations about the dangers of pride. Elanina's name continued to appear in society columns, sometimes beside praise for philanthropy, sometimes in whispers that carried a darker subtext. William retreated further into a life of quiet inquiry and witness. Years later, memory shifted shape as new facts surfaced in private conversations. An old maid, on her deathbed, mumbled of an afternoon when she had seen a cup placed near a certain seat. A grocer remembered selling a box once and later wondering why he had kept the receipt. Such late details never carried the force of an official subpoena, but they altered the texture of recollection. People who had once been willing to ignore discomfort found themselves reconsidering the line between accident and design. Word of these murmurs crept into quiet journals and the margins of family Bibles. Thus history accumulates like sediment, each layer partly concealing and partly illuminating what lies beneath. Elanina aged with dignity and a public reputation polished by years of visible benevolence. She drew her curtains differently and wrote letters that soothed those who needed soothing. To many she remained an exemplar of restraint and stewardship. William's life unraveled in quieter ways. His business interests suffered and his social circle narrowed to a few loyal friends who refused to be swayed by gossip alone. He moved with a sadness that sometimes seemed to be the only honest thing left in his household. The O'Sullivans moved slowly toward quieter lives. Patrick found steady work where his name was less noticed. Bridget's sisters married in low-profile ceremonies and left Hartford for towns where anonymity might protect memory from constant re-probing. Now and then, a document surfaced, an invoice tucked behind a ledger, a notation in the margin of a lawyer's letter, and for a time the town reignited with speculation. Each rediscovery was a small eruption, a reminder that secrets have a way of leaking at weak seams. Still, formal justice rarely returns to a wound once the months have been negotiated by wealth and position. The archives contained clues and the archives contained veils. Facts were present, and yet the means to convert them into final adjudication remained elusive. What remained most remarkable was the unequal access to narrative. Those with standing could persuade the public of even improbable versions of events, while the poor could not force attention, even when their memories were precise. Across generations, the story bent into a moral tale, a caution about power, about maternal will, and about the capacity of institutions to protect reputation at the expense of clarity. Decades slid by and Elenina's prominence did not entirely fade. She maintained influence through charity and the careful curation of legacy. Portraits hung in parlors, and the Peaton name remained linked to institutions that bore donations under its banner. In the autumn of her later years, a young relative cleaning the attic discovered a sealed packet among Jonathan's old papers, a folded note, some penciled marginalia, and a list of names crossed out with impatience. The packet was not an open confession, but it hinted at preoccupation and intent. When the packet's existence became known, it rippled through certain private circles. Friends of Bridget read the description in private and felt vindication in the idea that someone had kept records that might explain the mystery. Elenina died with a calm that many mistook for saintliness. The funeral was attended by the city's dignitaries who offered measured praise and remembered her public works. William stood at the edge of the ceremony, a solitary figure whose sorrow had weathered into a kind of wary acceptance. Buried papers and late, found notes did not, in themselves, satisfy the hunger for definitive answers. Historians and curious relatives catalogued the documents, argued over their interpretation, and filed copies in notebooks that would pass to future generations more eager for certainty than those who had lived through the events. In private salons, some argued that the packet revealed evidence of planning and intent. Others insisted the notes were the anxious scribbles of a woman who feared change. The same fragments supplied opposite narratives depending on the reader's predisposition. William's voice grew quieter in those years, and he left Hartford more often for journeys that seemed half pilgrimage and half exile. Bridget's grave received visiting wreaths in small numbers. Neighbors remembered a young life ended too soon, and some older women still told the tale at kitchen tables where they mixed grief with the pragmatics of survival. The attic note became a whisper that haunted portraits and parlors alike. The ghost of the Trinity incident reached into Hartford's markets and committee rooms like a subtle contagion. Business decisions were shaded by caution, and marriage negotiations carried a new category of risk association with scandal. Influential families recalculated alliances, cautious that a careless marital connection might invite whispers that damaged credit and reputation. Boards remade their lists of acceptable partners, and the city's social algorithm grew more conservative where it had once been experimental. William, once set to inherit a comfortable stewardship, found his prospects narrowed. He managed properties with a distracted hand, and lenders who had once smiled now required reassurances and sometimes additional collateral. Some opportunists used the episode as leverage, hinting at insider knowledge and offering brokered introductions in exchange for favors. Others used the story to discredit rivals. At the same time, anti-immigrant sentiment, already simmering in Hartford, found a new outlet. Voices that sought to blame the city's changing fabric amplified the tragedy into a moral argument. Newcomers, they said, threatened the social order and must be tempered by law and custom. Clubs and societies convened debates about charity and assimilation, about proper boundaries, and about the nature of civic belonging. In these forums, the tragedy of a single wedding was repurposed as a cautionary tale about the limits of inclusion. Yet there was an uneasy countercurrent. Others argued that Hartford's strength came from its ability to absorb difference without collapsing, and they used the Peton tragedy to advocate for institutions that ensured fairness rather than privilege. These conversations shaped policy as much as opinion. Schools and employers reconsidered hiring, and parish outreach shifted languages to meet immigrant needs, in part to ease tensions, and in part to demonstrate proactive civility. The event's utility as a caution left a mixed legacy. Some policies hardened barriers, while others attempted to mend them. Municipal leaders balanced reputation with a diverse city's practical needs. It haunted Hartford's conversations for many decades. In the decades that followed, black dresses and formal condolences did not erase the way the story percolated into civic memory. It was taught as a caution in some parlors and suppressed in others, and historians decades later would find that the event had become a mirror reflecting whatever anxieties their era most feared. Scholars and antiquarians combed through municipal records and family Bibles, copying marginal notes and comparing accounts. The story was episodic in the archive, a docket here, a fragmentary letter there, each item requiring interpretation and the risk of projecting modern meaning onto old wounds. At one point, a local antiquarian published a pamphlet that argued alternately for malice or coincidence and stirred debate. The pamphlet's sold copies stirred debate, and then settled into the quiet stacks of the town library. Collectors copied clippings, schoolteachers used the tale as a parable, town meetings referenced the tragedy in cautious, passing remarks over many years. Generations born after the event could only apprehend it through mediated artifacts, newspaper clippings, family lore, and the occasional discovered note. Such mediation allowed for myth-making, and myth rapidly outpaced careful truth. William's direct descendants slowly dispersed, some left Hartford entirely, carrying the story like a private inheritance they did not want to pass on. Others remained and felt the weight of an ambiguous past in the way neighbors greeted them at markets. A small group of Bridget's descendants kept the memory alive through oral histories, preserving recipes, song fragments, and the soft cadences of story that do not translate into formal evidence yet sustain community identity. Occasionally, scholars visited and reminded citizens that history is a negotiation between curiosity and protection. The town learned to live with ambiguity. Multiple stories coexisted like overlapping shadows, each claiming its own moral. To understand Ella Lenina, look beyond transactions to how power reshapes inner life. Control, practiced daily, becomes a lens that turns possibility into threat. She was schooled in rituals of assent, whom to flatter, which causes to back. Those practices became a scaffold she equated with moral duty. Public standing determined access to redress and opportunity. To lose it was to lose agency, and that prospect scarred like an existential wound. Her fear of dilution, of the Peton name mingled with foreign blood, echoed broader anxieties about demographic change and commercial modernity, anxieties she used as justification. Motive does not excuse method, yet motive explains how drastic measures feel necessary. Preservation of legacy became moralized into urgent necessity. Institutions often enabled concealment, church officers economic partners, and legal advisors preferred quiet solutions to public upheaval, and such preference could be exploited. This pattern was not merely local. Throughout the century, communities chose order over inquiry, and those choices let private actors wrap transgressions in propriety. The tragedy sits where individual willingness to harm meets civic systems that absorb scandal rather than interrogate power. A recipe for injustice when social capital outpaces accountability. Psychological control and social control mirror each other. A woman who orchestrated household rituals could manipulate public performance with the same skill, turning mastery into appearance. Her case asks a larger question: when guardians of tradition believe themselves the sole keepers of culture, how often do they cross from stewardship into domination? Beneath those particulars lies a pattern that repeats across generations: the consolations of privilege, the mechanisms of protection, and the quiet transactions that secure reputation. Corruption here is not a shouting crime, but a low, continual rearrangement of narrative. gifts exchanged, favors rendered, and silence bartered for a semblance of stability. It is ancient because it is human groups form, trust those who signal belonging, and defend the boundaries of the group. Those boundaries harden into institutions that codify partial accounts as if they were whole truth. In Ilolanina's case, the machinery was domestic and civic. Household rituals trained obedience, public philanthropy bought goodwill, and the language of charity provided cover. When private intent collides with public deference, narratives bend to protect power, and some voices are muffled by the weight of reputation. To learn from that imbalance, we must notice small mechanisms. Who is invited, which donations are made, which records are sealed, and insist they be transparent to future scrutiny, and relentlessly. William's search for moral clarity was a slow erosion that consumed the rest of his life. He had set out to retrieve a sense of justice for Bridget, but what he found were obstacles shaped by affection, law, and calculation. He tried, at different moments, to act within the law and outside it. He petitioned for evidence, he questioned witnesses, he pressed lawyers, and he begged for new inquiries. Each attempt met polite resistance or strategic deflection. One winter evening he confronted Ilolanina in the peaten study, where the fire burned as if to demand confession. He asked directly whether she knew more than she said, and she answered, calm, luminous with the certainty of a woman who had long seen herself as guardian of a name. Her denial contained its own logic. She spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of a fragile legacy she believed she protected. Her voice had the persuasive tone of someone who had practiced rhetoric at many parlor tables. Whether that rhetoric concealed guilt or genuine belief remained ambiguous. William, ravaged by doubt and grief, made choices that emptied his accounts. He withdrew investments, refused social invitations, and finally, defeated by the slow machinery of influence, sold properties to pay off creditors and retreated from public life. Those who observed him in later life saw a man diminished by sorrow but not by curiosity. He traveled to examine distant records, corresponded with antiquarians, and maintained notebooks full of questions that never resolved into closure. In private, he kept a small locket with a faded scrap of Bridget's handwriting inside. He died some years later in a small house outside Hartford, attended by a few loyal friends. His passing was marked by soft condolences and a quiet sense that a singular human life had been shaped and perhaps broken by loyalties both personal and social. In the end, William's story read like a footnote to the larger tragedy, a man who loved and lost, and who spent years trying to reckon with what had been taken from him. The ripples from Trinity extended beyond Peaton and O'Sullivan families. They became part of Hartford's invisible infrastructure. Townsfolk used the episode to warn of the dangers of mixing classes, to explain sudden financial reversals, and to justify gatekeeping in social circles. Over time, the story was invoked in meetings of boards and guilds, used as shorthand for the price of defying established norms. The narrative served as a caution at charity banquets and at the sermons of ministers who wanted congregations to remember the value of prudence. More dangerous was the way institutions adapted. Where once civic bodies might have insisted on full disclosure in crises, they increasingly leaned on mediation and private settlement, reasoning that public scandal did more harm than public reckoning. That logic, while pragmatic, permitted privately administered solutions that favored the influential. It created a parallel justice where social capital functioned as currency exchanged for silence, and set a pattern for how powerful families could manage reputational threats. In quieter corners, marginalized people learned to guard themselves. Some formed mutual aid networks, others emigrated. The tragedy fed a darker cultural appetite as writers and lecturers spun tales of maternal malice and households keeping private arsenals of influence and secrecy. The phrase, "the wine burned," moved from a factual utterance to an emblematic line in cautionary tales. Yet alongside sensationalism, a minority sought reform, clergy called for more transparent inquiry, and merchants pushed for legal changes to reduce wealth's capacity to suppress investigation. Those reforms were slow and partial, but they marked a shift in thinking. The afterlife of Trinity played out in policy, gossip, and memory, and so the story persisted, mutating across generations. In the late autumn of her life, surrounded by the fraying tapestries of a once grand drawing room, Ilolanina received a visitor few expected, a distant cousin who had always admired her control and who now came as a bearer of small consolations. She was thin, her hands like maps, and her voice had the brittle clarity of someone whose choices had lodged in the body. The cousin pressed a hand to her wrist and asked, with the ordinary politeness reserved for the dying, whether she felt remorse. She spoke not in denial nor confession, but in a sentence that would be read as both. I did what I thought necessary to protect what was entrusted to me. Those words landed like a verdict for some and like a prayer for others. She described without explicitness the ache of a legacy she had been taught to guard, the way fear of dilution had become as real to her as hunger, and the manner in which conviction hardened into action when the future felt at stake. The cousin asked if she wished to be forgiven, and Elena hesitated before admitting that she wanted to be understood rather than crucified. Forgiveness is for the living, she said, but understanding might be our last mercy. Those final exchanges circulated among relatives like a new sort of evidence, not legal but human. Some took them as thin parchment, the language of rationalization. Others took them as admission wrapped in dignity, a woman trying to make sense of measures she could not unmake. At her funeral, eulogists praised a life of stewardship and civic virtue. Yet among certain listeners there was a different feeling, a quiet, persistent disquiet that refused to be smoothed by flattery. William did not attend Elena's burial. He had left Hartford years earlier, and his absence became another line in the ledger of loss, a symbol that not all relationships return after fracture. The remark reopened debates. Some relatives accepted it as wary justification, others heard a final admission. For a town inclined to tidy stories, the lack of closure proved intolerable, and still, this is where the torn threads meet and reveal a pattern tie. Hartford 1841 is not merely an old scandal, but a mirror for how power, fear, and preservation make tragedy. The bride and a cup start the tale, but its shape concerns who can preserve legacy and how institutions sometimes favor appearance over justice. Elena Peaton transformed fortune into stewardship and stewardship into identity. That identity hardened into a compulsion to maintain purity of name and justify acts others call monstrous. To some she was preservation incarnate, to others she was domination. Judgment depends on vantage, and vantage is shaped by class and the stories handed down. Institutions meant to protect communities can default to protecting reputation, and in that default they can conceal harm rather than confront it. The Peaton affair warns how moral language can be used to preserve power and how private conviction can produce public damage. For you, the listener, this story is an invitation to changed attention. Notice how invitations map power, how charity can shield impropriety, and how silence can be purchased. History is not a closed cabinet, but a mirror that shows repeated patterns, privilege reproducing itself in ways both ornate and banal, and preservation paid for in human lives. Carry this tale as a question, not a neat lesson. Ask who benefits when truth is softened and who is made expendable in the name of reputation. Demand institutions whose default is transparency, not concealment. Keep memory honest, listen to marginalized voices, and be the witness history asks for. Look closely at the small mechanics, lists of guests, the placement of pews, the language of condolence used as armor. Those micro-rituals are not trivial. They are the apparatus by which social truth is produced. Under the guise of propriety, bargains are struck and records are curated to favor those who hold sway. That is the forbidden knowledge hiding in plain sight, how influence rearranges evidence, and how visibility can be a weapon. If you want to resist these patterns, begin by listening to and insist institutions answer plainly to the people served.